Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Alexandria Center for Hellenistic Studies and Institute for Mediterranean Studies Neoplatonic lecture. Today, I am greatly honored to introduce a very distinguished speaker, Professor Lloyd Gerson. As we all know, Professor Gerson is professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto. His work focuses mainly on Plato and Platonism. In fact, he has developed his own approach to Plato and Platonism, almost, I would say, potentially a new school of thought on the Platonic tradition. He is author of some 25 books, author or editor or co-author, and of 250 or more than 250 papers and book chapters or reviews. So besides the translation of Plotinus' Aeneads, of which a second edition is forthcoming, the Cambridge History of Philosophy in Late Antiquity, and the two Plotinus companions, Cambridge companions to Plotinus, the first one in 1996 and the second one in 2022 with James Wilberding. Here are some more titles of his books. Plotinus, Routledge, 1994. Hellenistic Philosophy, Introductory Readings with Brad Inwood, Hackett, 1997, second edition. Aristotle, Critical Assessments, 4 volumes, Routledge, 1999. Knowing Persons, A Study in Plato, Oxford University Press, 2003. Neoplatonic Philosophy, Introductory Readings, together with Professor Dillon, Hackett, 2004. Aristotle and Other Platonists, Cornell, 2005. Ancient Epistemology, Cambridge University Press, 2009. From Plato to Platonism, Cornell, 2013. Plotinus, Aenead, 5.5, that the intelligibles are not external to the intellect, Introduction, Translation, and Commentary, Parmenides Press, 2013. And more recently, Plato's Moral Realism, Cambridge University Press, 2023. So today, Professor Gerson will talk on taking Plato seriously, Proclus as an exegete. And there is a handout which I shall share via the chat. And Professor Gerson, thank you again for being here today.
Thank you very much, Irene, and thank you for inviting me. One little reaction to your very generous introduction. When you said a new school of interpretation, a chill ran down my spine. I certainly hope that nothing that I do is a new interpretation of Plato. That reminds me that when Jacques Maritain heard that people were calling him a neo-scholastic, he replied in horror, "I'm a paleo-Thomist, a paleo-scholastic. I'm not a neo-scholastic at all." I hope that what I do in working on Plato is a continuation of a very, very long tradition, and not something new at all. In any case,
if I may.
Yes.
So I think that this comment is very Plotinian in a way, because Plotinus would also say that I am an interpreter of Plato, and he was indeed following a very long tradition. But what I meant for that is that if someone gives me a text and I start reading, it is very likely that I can say that this is by Lloyd Gerson, by the way thoughts are developed. So this is what I meant.
Okay, thank you, Irene. Well, this paper is a kind of trailer for a book I'm working on the Platonism of Proclus. You may take it as a kind of interim report on my research. It's practically a commonplace among students of ancient philosophy that Proclus's personal philosophical works go far beyond what any reasonable interpretation of Plato would countenance. And yet there is no doubt that Proclus believed himself to be an accurate and assiduous exegete of Plato. Hegel, in his History of Philosophy, remarked that Proclus was a more accurate exegete of Plato than was Plotinus, because Plotinus, unlike Proclus, was overly influenced by Aristotle. Since I think Aristotle was a Platonist, I don't think being influenced by Aristotle is something that negates your bona fides as a Platonist, in any case. So the question I ask in this paper is, can we understand how Proclus proceeds from his commentaries on the dialogues to his own constructive metaphysics? Among scholars of Proclus, there is widespread agreement that the key to understanding Proclus's philosophy is indeed to be found in his commentaries on the dialogues of Plato. Controversy arises naturally enough when it comes to the details of the path from the one to the other. Etienne Gilson, a shrewd student of the history of philosophy, and certainly no friend of Proclus, suggested in his Being and Some Philosophers that if one embraced Plato's philosophy as true, then one would end up with Proclean metaphysics. Gilson took Proclean metaphysics as self-evidently absurd, leading him to deny the antecedent. For Gilson, the only ancient philosopher who was suitable for use in constructing Christian philosophy was Aristotle. Nevertheless, Gilson inadvertently confirms the Hegelian point that Proclus was a highly accurate exegete of Plato. Coupling this assessment with a contemporary scholarly opinion that Proclus's own philosophy is derived from that exegesis leads to the puzzle confronted in this paper. So one way of framing the issue with which I shall be concerned is whether the Platonism that we can derive from Plato himself and the Platonism of Proclus stand or fall together. Not surprisingly, many will respond to this question dismissively, arguing either that the Platonism of Proclus is obviously far removed from the Platonism of Plato, or, perhaps less plausibly, that Platonism itself is far removed from what we might find in the dialogues of Plato, at any rate. By contrast, I am going to try to show that there is a real question here worthy of serious investigation. There is no doubt that insinuating Proclus, or indeed any of the so-called Neoplatonists, into the Platonic orbit goes against the grain of much modern scholarship. It is hardly fanciful or scurrilous to point out that in this scholarship, even parts of Plato are cast out beyond the pale as not fitting a conception of what I have elsewhere called Plato light. A Plato conceived of as mainly devoted to expounding and defending the philosophy of his teacher Socrates. I suppose that among contemporary scholars of ancient philosophy, the proposition, if Plato, then Proclus, has been given a vanishingly small bit of attention apart from those who, like Gilson, gladly endorse it as a means of ridding Christian philosophy of a Platonic pall altogether. Here I am going to expose some of the results of an experiment in following Proclus in taking Plato seriously. I shall explain in a moment what exactly I mean by this phrase, but first, a little background. And I give this for those of you who may not be au courant with the commentaries, the literature on the commentaries. Originating probably with Iamblichus in the 4th century of this era, the teaching of Plato by Platonists focused on a curriculum consisting of the following dialogues: Alcibiades I, Gorgias, Phaedo, Cratylus, Theaetetus, Sophist, Statesman, Phaedrus, Symposium, and Philebus. The course of study culminated in 2 capstone dialogues, Timaeus and Parmenides. When Proclus came to Athens around 429-430 at the age of 18, he commenced the study of this curriculum, but only after undertaking a preliminary 2 years with Plutarch of Athens, reading the major works of Aristotle, the locus of the so-called lower mysteries, before moving on to the Platonic higher mysteries. He must have spent about 4 years on the dialogues with Plutarch's successor, Syrianus, When Syrianus died in 437, Proclus was appointed head of the academy at the remarkably young age of 25. According to his biographer, perhaps better hagiographer, Marinus, by the time he was 28, he had written his own commentary on Timaeus, and as Marinus adds, much more. Marinus does not tell us what else specifically he had written by this time, but it's likely that the list indeed includes at least commentaries on some of the other dialogues in the curriculum. Extant are his commentaries on the Timaeus, about 1,000 pages of Greek text, his commentary on the Parmenides, running to 600 pages of Greek text, neither one of which is complete. His commentary on Alcibiades, running to some 400 pages of text, also probably not complete. A fragment of a commentary on Cratylus, about 100 pages, and a sort of commentary on Republic, which is actually a collection of 17 essays on specific topics, running to some 800 pages. All told, there are about 3,000 pages of commentary extant. I might add, for those of my colleagues who have had from time to time complained about their workloads, Marinus tells us that Proclus wrote 700 lines a day while teaching 5 classes of exegesis and sometimes more, meeting regularly with visiting philosophers, and conducting additional unscripted evening seminars, something like, I suppose, quadlibitals of a sort. He also kept up an elaborate and demanding schedule of ritual prayer. There were, need I add, no weekends or summer breaks in the schedule. He did all this while managing the business affairs of the academy. Not extant are documented commentaries on Philebus, Phaedrus, Phaedo, Theodotus, perhaps the Symposium as well, and Sophist. We do not know the publication dates of his most important personal works, namely Platonic theology and Elements of Theology, although it is generally agreed that they were written fairly late in his career. More important than their precise dating is that Proclus repeatedly says he derived his interpretation of Plato from his teacher Syrianus, who, as we have seen, died when he was 25. Hence, the virtually uncontested assumption that the early commentaries should be the place to look for insights into how Proclus could find in the dialogues and in the old academic testimony regarding Plato's philosophy the origins of his own metaphysical construct. Proclus claims that a Platonist is tasked with filling in the intermediate steps within the Platonic system, between the one and whatever has any part of divinity in any way. This is text number 1. He is here referring specifically to Parmenides, though he adds that other dialogues should be added as support. 2 questions immediately arise. Why should we think that there are any gaps in the presentation of doctrine in the dialogues? And 2, why should we think that Proclus is well placed to fill these gaps in? The first question is much easier to answer than is the second, and it is in response to the second question that I shall devote the bulk of this paper. But let us settle the first question first. Of course, Plato explicitly left gaps. Perhaps the most important one for our purposes comes in Book 6 of Republic, where Socrates alludes to a longer road to the most important subject, which is the idea of the good, and a few pages later to be the unhypothetical first principle of all. Just after concluding his remarks on the idea of the good in comparison with the sun, and just before he turns to the divided line, Socrates says, I am really leaving out a lot. Sokna gea polepo. This is number 2A and 2B. I think there is no credibility whatsoever in the claim, sometimes made, that the longer role and the lots that Socrates leave out are somehow actually taken up later in the dialogue. This seems particularly evident from the fact that Aristotle testifies to important stages in this longer road, which have no parallel in the dialogues. All told, there are many passages, perhaps 200, in the dialogues in which Socrates puts off the discussion of a subject to another time. Usually, but not always, this subject is the good, the first principle of all. I conclude that Proclus is well justified in supposing that there really is a longer road which includes intermediary steps that are not, for one reason or another, explicitly established in the dialogues. Furthermore, Plato himself, in all likelihood, attempted to fill in some of these gaps himself. I have in mind specifically the introduction of the principle of limit and unlimitedness in the Philebus, attributed to the ancients, which are unmentioned in earlier dialogues and which invite integration into a hierarchical ontological framework, alongside the forms, the gods, and the superordinate idea of the good. I also mentioned as well, and I'll return to this passage, the famous passage in the Sophist, in which the Eleatic stranger says that life and soul and intellect can't be separated from the really real, something that the friends of the forms either assumed or wanted to do, something that is gap filling, it seems to me. The much more difficult question I mentioned above is why Proclus, or we, should think that he is well placed to expose them. Those who approach the dialogues primarily as literary works will insist that even references to a longer road or to leaving out a lot provide no justification for maintaining that there really are doctrinal gaps amidst the dialogues. This is so because a literary work has a sort of integrity that precludes reaching beyond the integral whole. Thus, even explicit gaps belong to the unified artistic product and have no meaning outside of it. Indeterminacy is a principle inseparable from the literary hermeneutics. Some scholars who take the literary approach, sensing that the ad hocery of this position, suggest that longer roads amount to a vague gesture aimed at the reader, something like an author of a textbook saying, "I leave this to the reader's personal reflection." Or think of Virgil telling Dante in the middle of Purgatorio, "My art can only take you this far. From now on, you will have to be guided by il tuo piacere." Proclus is intensely interested in the literary aspects of every dialogue, but far from believing that these aspects somehow preclude doctrinal content, he thinks that they all have to be understood as contributing to doctrine. That is, given that each dialogue has a pedagogical goal, a skopos, the literary features of the dialogues must be interpreted as contributing to achieving that goal. In this regard, I offer as one example out of literally hundreds, Parmenides' comment on Parmenides 138a3f, where Parmenides and Zeno react to Socrates' attempt to counter Zeno's argument by expounding his theory of forms. Their reaction includes benignly smiling to each other, in contrast to Pythagoras, who is apprehensive that the two giants of philosophy are going to be annoyed by young Socrates' implied insolence. Proclus goes on for almost 2 pages in explaining the meaning of those smiles and the contrast between the refined philosophical characters of Parmenides and Zeno and the rather superficial Pythagoras. Proclus sees this human moment in the dialogue as guiding us along the way to Socrates' education under the tutelage of Parmenides. I take it that the contemporary literary approach to the dialogues also holds as a fundamental principle that the literary elements of the dialogue are indispensable to understanding Plato's philosophy. How could they seriously think otherwise? It is just that they never quite seem to get there and actually show how this is so. It is all wind up and no pitch, or so it seems to me. There is another important dialectical point to emphasize. Naturally, those who focus on the literary structure of the dialogue to the exclusion of everything else, whether explicitly or implicitly, confine themselves to the highly implausible position of treating each dialogue as a sort of self-contained silo within which it is illicit to exit in order to get help from another ensiled work. One dialogue cannot be used to assist in interpreting another. That this is practically an impossible position to maintain is evident from the fact that almost no one, in fact, does maintain it. And also from the fact that those who promise to give us Plato dialogue by dialogue really keep their promise. But if it is legitimate to use one dialogue to help interpret another, then there is doctrine behind or beyond any one dialogue. Of course, Plato himself regularly has one dialogue referred to another, presumably to alert the reader that what was said in another dialogue is important for what is being said in the present work. Back to the question of why Proclus thinks that he is in a position to fill in the gaps. I suppose a good way to approach the answer to this question is to start with a prior question. What sort of edifice do these gaps or intermediary steps belong to? I appreciate the fact that when I say that Plato constructed a system, or more accurately, a derivation system, I am likely to induce more than a modicum of skepticism. Let me try to make an ironic proposal for a rather minimalist definition of what I mean by a system. 2 points are paramount. Plato says that the good is the unhypothetical first principle of all, text 3. That alone, in my mind, warrants the use of the word system. But it will be justly said in reply that there are many philosophers who embrace an unhypothetical first principle of all who are decidedly not systematic philosophers. Think of Descartes, or Kierkegaard, or Levinas, or countless others. Why is Plato different? There is a fairly simple philosophical reason for this contained in the dialogue itself. Plato says that the good is beyond ousia, apekinetes ousias. For this reason, it is beyond any limitation, since ousia is a principle of limitation. Proclus assumes that when Plato, comparing the good to the sun, says that the sun is, in a way, tropontina, the cause, ACHS, of all the things one sees, the analogy to the good leads us to infer that the good is the cause of everything in a way. It's text 4. As such, it is apparently that tihikanon, referred to in Phaedo as a terminus of philosophical explanation, thereby making everything else instrumental to the first principle of all. The unlimitedness of the good entails that its ubiquity in causal explanations is not that of a per accidens series, but of a per se series. Thus, its causality is ubiquitous throughout the universe. Hence, there is system here. To suppose that the good, like some deistic deity, does nothing, or that what it does is explicitly limited in a way, is to falsely attribute to it an ousia. But perhaps this will seem some to miss the point. For an omnipotent God could well be taken to be at the top of what, at least in philosophical terms, is an unsystematic cosmos. Plato's good, however, eternally is flowing out, epirouton, is not to be conceived of voluntaristically or even personally. The God operates eternally and without limitation. So however we conceive of this operation, this conception cannot imply that there is something that some other principle can do that excludes the good from involvement in that activity. This involvement cannot amount to co-causality or subordination of the good to the real cause. This is so because both alternatives imply a limitation on the good. I will return to the eternal and ubiquitous activity of the good shortly. For the moment, however, I only want to insist that such activity is sufficient to indicate a systematic unity in Plato's philosophy. For all causal connections must ultimately be traced back to the good. The gaps that Proclus aims to fill are, for the most part, gaps in these causal connections. If we agree that Plato repeatedly alludes to a longer way in philosophy, that his philosophy is systematic in the way I've described, and that Proclus, with the benefit of having access not only to hundreds of pages of testimony to Plato's unwritten teachings, to which we also have access, but to much that we do not, aims to fill in gaps in the presentation of that system, then his general exegetical program seems far from being quixotic or fanciful. These gaps are, as I will show, mainly implications taken from what Plato actually says in the dialogues or is reported to have said in his oral teachings. Proclus is, in short, constrained only by logic and by his own philosophical imagination, and not by a dearth of text or fundamental misunderstanding of the author's intent. Let me briefly provide a simple and far-reaching example of Proclus's gap filling. In Timaeus summarizes his account thus: the world consists of three components: forms, sensibles, and the receptacle. The last mentioned is the realm of ananke, that with which the demiurge has to contend in order to make the sensible world as close as possible to the forms. But Proclus reasons that the unlimitedness of the good or one supervenes on this limitation in the demiurge. In fact, the good or one must be the cause of the being of the receptacle, understood, like Aristotle, as matter. It should be emphasized here that Proclus, unlike so many modern readers of Plato, does not ignore Timaeus's remark at 48c 2-6, that we are not now going to speak of a first principle or principles of the generation of the receptacle and its content. Plato puts that aside, reinforcing the point that the limitation on the demiurge is not a limitation on the first principle of all, the good or one. If it is a gap in Plato's presentation that he does not attribute the being of the receptacle to the good, it is a gap that demands filling according to Plato's own principles. What I think is legitimate to ask would be the reason for someone refusing to fill the gap. Such a refusal in this case seems to me to utterly destroy the systematic unity of Plato's metaphysics, which is perhaps, after all, the reason for the refusal. Of course, one can read the Bible as literature, but that does not preclude the reading of it as containing doctrine. That there is doctrine in the dialogue seems to me at any rate hardly contestable. If the being of the receptacle or matter is not ultimately explained by the good or one, then the door is open for ad hoc explanations or proximate but question-begging explanations, or rejection of explanations altogether. All these possibilities may be argued for, but none of them have much to do with Plato. When I say that Proclus takes Plato seriously, I mean to contrast his approach, not with those who think that the philosopher Plato is a misguided disciple of Socrates, or that he is a kind of fantasy writer, or that his dialogues, as one of my late colleagues believed, were only fit to be used in an elementary logic course as textbook examples of logical fallacies. Rather, I mean to contrast him with those who pick the parts of the dialogue they like and ignore the rest, and with those who think Plato could not mean what he says, or that he could possibly accept the implication of what he says, and especially with those who think that charity behooves us to translate what Plato does say into what he should have said, or at least what he would have said if he had been the beneficiary of a 20th century education in analytic philosophy. Taking Plato seriously does not mean always taking him literally. Proclus frequently has recourse to allegory, for example. He, like Plato, has keen appreciation of metaphor, but for both, metaphor is primarily an ontological concept. Metaphor is only secondarily a literary trope. Thus, causal connections in the sensible world are taken to be analogs of their paradigms in the intelligible world. Perhaps the best known example of his rejection of a literal interpretation is his argument for denying that in Timaeus, the creation of the cosmos is temporal, or ex nihilo. In doing this, he applies general principles and these theses of Platonic metaphysics in order to arrive at what he regards as the most satisfying philosophical conclusion, which is always, we must suppose, what Plato intends. We all acknowledge that, as historians of philosophy, our subject, who has been determined to have asserted A, cannot be supposed to have assented to B, even if we think that A implies B. Perhaps if he realized that A implies B, he would have recoiled from A because he found B incredible. An important dimension of Proclus's commitment to taking Plato seriously is that Proclus is not, or is not primarily, a historian of philosophy. Proclus is no more a historian of philosophy than, say, Thomas Aquinas is a biblical scholar. Both philosophers read scripture, Proclus the dialogues of Plato, the Orphic writings, and the so-called Chaldean oracles, Aquinas the Old and New Testament, with a view ultimately to salvation. It is difficult to imagine a reader with an intent more serious than that. Such a characterization of Proclus's intent will naturally elicit the complaint that, if that is the case, perhaps Proclus takes Plato too seriously. One possible example of this is Proclus's comment on the lemma in Timaeus, in which Plato has Timaeus say that it is the task to discover the maker and father of this cosmos. Proclus goes on at some length, considering the question, what is the difference between a maker and a father? He also asked Plato why Plato writes maker and father rather than father and maker. Proclus finds the answer to his question by situating the account of the demiurge here within the larger Platonic system. In reply to the complaint that Proclus takes Plato too seriously, I think the only thing to be said is that Proclus, like Aristotle, takes Plato as seriously as Plato takes himself. And I say this fully aware of Platonic wit and irony and his literary imagination. In the remainder of this paper, I will focus on two major examples of the results of taking Plato seriously, according to Proclus. The first is the rather notorious doctrine of Henads that Proclus introduces in his Parmenides commentary and then develops at considerable length in his Elements of Theology and his Platonic theology. The second, and here I can in no way cover all the relevant material, is his doctrine of the essentially triadic structure of the universe. In order to appreciate the doctrine of Henads, we first need to reflect for a moment on some of the exigencies of positing an unhypothetical first principle of all. First, this principle must be unqualifiedly simple, a plotaton. If it were not so, then, as Plato says, there would be within it a minimal distinction between it and whatever property or characteristic it has in virtue of which we say that it is not unqualifiedly simple. It must, that is, participate in ousia. Because the first principle is unqualifiedly simple, absolutely everything else must be complex. For two or more unqualifiedly simple things would need attributes to differentiate them, in which case they would each be complex and not simple. For Proclus, this elementary point has monumental implications, principally that complexity is ubiquitous in the intelligible world. It is simply false that, as Proclus thought Aristotle believed, immateriality entails unqualified simplicity. But unqualified simplicity can only be uniquely instantiated. If the first principle is unqualifiedly simple, then it cannot itself be participated. This is text number 8. Why? Because being participated requires a distinction within that which is participated between the ousia, nature or essence, that is participated, and the entity whose nature it is. Proclus invokes this crucial distinction when he claims to have, which he claims to have gotten from Iamblichus. He distinguishes the participant to metechon, that which is participated to metechomenon, and that which is unparticipated to amethekton. This is number 9. It is really only C that is absolutely transcendent, exeromenos. There is no impeccable Platonic provenance for this. There is an impeccable Platonic provenance for this distinction. In Phaedo, Socrates distinguishes between the largeness in the form of largeness and the largeness in us. And in Sophist, in the passage dealing with the megastogene, in deriving the megastogene, the Eleatic visitor says that each is different from the other, not owing to its own nature, tein autou phusin, but owing to its partaking in the idea of difference. Presumably, this applies to the idea of difference itself, as well as to the other gene. If a form can partake in its own nature, then there must be a distinction within it and that nature. In addition, in Philebus, the distinction is made between the identical nature as it exists in an eternal entity and as it exists in its sensible and ever-becoming participants. As Proclus eventually points out, with this distinction, Plato can meet Aristotle's objection to the effect that participating in a form not only entails having an instance of that form's nature, but also having the properties of the form itself, including eternity. And finally, in the text 5 above, we read that the form itself does not enter into anything else. This is so despite the fact that it is participated. So, the first principle of all cannot be participated, but if this is the case, then how can the good have any causal efficacy anywhere? For whatever we may suppose the good to do, the result of it having done that is that whatever is the effect of its putative causality has some property or nature that it would not otherwise have. Consequently, there is a need for a second principle that is participated. But since the good is uniquely, unqualifiedly unparticipated, this second principle must not participate. So we have to have one that's completely unparticipated and a second principle that is participated but does not participate. That's the logic of an unhypothetical first principle of all. Therefore, it cannot have ousia. It must in fact be, this is text 10, hyperousios. The sought-for second principle cannot then be found among forms, for forms must participate owing to the fact that, as we have seen, within every form there is a distinction between it and its nature, the nature in which something that has that nature participates. Once again, the Platonic provenance of this claim is clear. In Philebus, Socrates says that all things have in themselves limit and unlimitedness, number 11. Because Proclus takes Plato seriously, he takes all things to apply to forms as well as to everything else. But we could have deduced this from the unique simplicity of the good. Anything other than the good is complex. Limit and unlimitedness are Plato's now preferred way to analyze the basic elements of any composite or complex. This is, I take it, Plato filling in the gaps in his own system, as presented earlier. So between the good and the intelligible world, there must be more than one set of secondary principles that are participated but do not participate. These are henads. Each henad must be the most unitary in its own class, where class indicates everything that has or participates in that nature. Number 12. The received opinion prior to Proclus, or either Iamblichus or Syrianus, depending on where Proclus got this, if he did get it from someone else, was that the form is the most unitary of things in a series of intelligible entities. But a form must, as we have seen, participate, so it cannot be primary. Nor can primary in a class belong to the primacy in a class belong to the unparticipated one. Each form is a unified henomenon complex. This complex is an existent with an essence. The one is the ultimate unifier, but not as participated in. Proclus adds, each of the gods is nothing but the one as participated. 13. These gods are the henads. They are the necessary connectors between the unparticipated one, or the one as unparticipated, and the forms. So each of the henads is unitary, heniaios, rather than unified, thereby needing nothing outside of it to unify it. Number 14. For this reason, we cannot know the henads or gods as they are in themselves, as unitary, but only as participated in, that is, as the source of the intelligible nature of any participant. Proclus emphasizes that the inference to the multiplicity of henads is derived precisely from the variation amongst forms. It is the irreducible variation amongst intelligible essence that demands participation in that which is beyond essence, hyperousios. So there must be as many henads as there are forms. If there were not, we could not account for variation among forms for which there is no corresponding henad. Proclus insists that there is a one-to-one correspondence between forms and henads. This correspondence almost inevitably elicits the suspicion that henads serve no purpose other than theological. But Proclus has also insisted that a henad is hyperousios, whereas a form is or has ousia. Thus, the functionality of the henad is not obliterated by the correspondence, and the suspicion that henads are otios in the system is removed, or at least lessened. What we are witnessing here is natural theology with a polytheistic rather than a monotheistic conclusion. On this approach, we reach godhood as the first principle of all, which upon analysis turns out to be polytheistic. But this is polytheism utterly drained of anthropomorphism, as Father Safre put it, for the leading gods of the hierarchy of henads are the principles of limit and unlimitedness. What in the dialogues and in the testimony about the oral tradition gives us reason to think that Plato Plato's undoubted systematic claims entail the existence of henads located between the one and forms. Well, the idea of the good provides truth to the forms, aletheia. This is number 15. Most scholars who have tried to take this claim seriously do not pay much attention to the nature of this truth. They focus on the good and the forms and suppose that the result of some mysterious atemporal process is that the forms become intelligible, which is what ontological truth is. Indeed, from Plato, all we have is the metaphor of flowing, epiruton. How this occurs is left unexamined. It's a gap. I would suggest that Proclus is correct in supposing that Plato gives us the basis for an answer to this question, although Plato did not spell it out himself. The good provides both enai and ousia to the forms. In other words, is the source of the unity of these two components. An existent without an ousia would not be knowable or have truth in it. An ousia without an existence would also not be knowable, since it would not be. It would be something like pure syntax without any matrix within this syntax, within which this syntax can be expressed, nor could it be one. So the good makes forms intelligible by providing them with a combination of enai and ousia. As a general point, this might seem sufficient, but plainly there is a multitude of ousiai, being as a one many, as Plato says. So the good does not provide existence and essence in general. What seems to be required is the causal explanation for a diversity of forms. But this cause or causes must be, as Plato says, beyond ousia. How, after all, as Plotinus wonders, can the one produce a many? Plotinus' answer to this question is elegant. The one produces first that which is minimally complex, that is, the least removed from the one. This is the indefinite dyad or unlimited, and it is this that the intellect is intellect in its initial phase of its generation. Since everything other than the one desires it as the good, this proto-intellect eternally desires and eternally satisfies its desire for the good by thinking all that the good is virtually. The diversity of forms is present by the reversion of intellect to the good. The flowing out from the good is like white light, and the diversity is like the color spectrum, and intellect is like a prism. This is a Platonian metaphor, but it's also in Damascus. Proclus is not seized by the elegance of the solution, because if we take the Philebus passage discussed above into account, the one itself would turn out to be identical with limit, and this limit would be prior to the generation of the unlimited. Proclus resists the asymmetry implied by this account. The virtuality of the one is correct, but it must be virtually both limit and unlimited. In fact, if forms are composed of limited and unlimited, these principles must be prior to the forms and yet in some way distinct from the one. Recall Proclus' systematic statement that the henads are the one as participated. The one does provide existence and essence to the forms. It unifies these elements or components of each form, number 16. But it does this via participation in the henads. Why does this participation not imply that there is ousia in the henads? Because, as we have seen, to import ousia into the henads would be to suppose that the henads get this by participation in something else, namely the one itself. But that is unparticipated. So there must be a special sort of participation which is in that which is hyperousios. The multiplicity of ousiai requires a multiplicity of henads to be participated in, and thus, as I suggested above, arises a polytheistic natural theology. The obvious objections to all this is that even if the Platonic system suggests the need for something mediating between the one and the many forms, Proclus's attempt to provide this seems ad hoc. He certainly freely admits to the secret union of the henads, that is, how the henads are in a way that we cannot understand expressions of the one. What we find in Proclus is definitely not the first or the last intrusion of religious mystery into metaphysics. I demur from any attempt to comment on the justification for this. I am more concerned with whether Proclus distorts Plato or helps bring to fulfillment the Platonic vision. And regarding the theme of this paper, I think Proclus has provided reasons for thinking that there is a gap between the one or the good and the forms, and that the Platonic system demands that henads, or something similar, are posited to fill it. Without a doubt, the crucial element in the exegetical foundation of this addition to the Platonic system is the interpretation of the second part of Parmenides. There is not, of course, time even to delve slightly beneath the surface of Proclus's interpretation of this dialogue, one which he says he got from his Doktorvater, Syrianus. The following very brief remark must suffice for now. It is essential to the Proclean vision, Proclean interpretation, that the one of the first hypothesis not be identical with the one of the second hypothesis. For Proclus interprets the former to be identical with the good and the transcendent source of everything, and the second to be identical with one being, the hypothesis of Parmenides himself, and to pantelos on of Republic and Sophist. That is, it is identical with the intelligible world. By contrast, many, though not all, modern interpretations of the second part of the dialogue insist that the one is used univocally throughout the exercise, whether this refers to the form of unity or to any random unit. Since it is the case that only on the Neoplatonic interpretation, broadly speaking, are there positive metaphysical conclusions reached in the second part of the dialogue, to say nothing of theological conclusions, the equivocity of one in the first two hypotheses is essential to establishing a coherent structure within which it even makes sense to postulate gaps. In fact, it seems quite straightforward to distinguish the two ones. The one of the first hypothesis is said in no way to partake of ousia, whereas the one of the second hypothesis is said it's not to be possible that it does not partake of ousia. This is text 17a and 17b. It is because the one is that we can distinguish within it its ani and its ousia. There's much more that can be said on this account, especially in the markedly different conclusions drawn from the hypothesis that the one of the first hypothesis and the one of the second do not exist. Suffice to say, the two different subjects of the two hypotheses start from the assumption that one is equivocal precisely in the way that the Republic implies by making the good above ousia and making the intelligible world or being one, but also complex, one being. On this basis, the gap filling described above proceeds. My second, last example pertains to the proliferation of triads in the architecture of the intelligible world. So much has been written on Proclus's triads that it is well to begin with the fundamental triad and its Platonic provenance. As Plato says in Republic, the good is overflowing, even though it itself has no becoming. And as Plato has said previously in the same dialogue, all things desire the good. Here we have basically all the elements of the fundamental architecture of the Platonic system, later expressed as remaining monet, procession, proodos, and reversion, epistrophe, as firmly rooted in the dialogues as any interpretation of Plato could possibly be. I'd like to emphasize that. What is often cited as a fundamental feature of Neoplatonism, the monet, proodos, and epistrophe, is as rooted in the dialogues of Plato as any interpretation by anybody listening to me today could possibly arrive at. This is so despite the fact that many insist on identifying it as a distinctive feature of something called Neoplatonism. It is essential to the integrity of the architectural framework that the reversion is precisely to that from which the procession comes. The reason for this is that Platonism aims to explain the temporal sensible world by the eternal non-sensible or intelligible world. If the idea of the good is ever the source of goodness in the sensible world, then it always is. Countenancing the possibility that the good demiurge should make the world according to the paradigm and then withdraw from it seriously misconstrues the hierarchical causal arrangement between the eternal and the temporal. So we should expect that the fundamental triad of remaining, procession, and reversion will be a structure that, like fractals, perpetually reproduces the basic dynamics. Remaining refers to the effects as they are eternally found in the cause. Possession is, so to speak, the obverse, the cause as it is found differentiated in its effects. Since all things, that is, all effects of the cause desire the good, reversion is to the cause as object of desire. This desire is the result of the sameness, homoiotes, of the effect in relation to the cause. A proof that the good from which all things come must be identical with the good at which all things aim will rely on the fact that the good must be beyond ousia. That is, it will maintain that what is beyond ousia must be unique, because non-uniqueness or multiplicity requires that ousia be present in each of the putative non-unique goods. Why then should we not suppose that the first principle from which everything comes is not the good, but something different, say the one, as apparently Speusippus speculated? There are, I imagine, at least two ways to answer this challenge. First, the one just is the good from the perspective of the first principle. The good just is the one from the perspective of the universal goal. Second, if there is a good, manifestation of which everyone desires, then it must be over and above any ousia. Since if it is identical with some ousia, say pleasure, as discussed in the Philebus, it is always rational to ask if that apparent good is really good for someone. Only if the good is beyond ousia is this question a rational one. But it is always rational for any ousia claimed to be the good, for any ousia that is claimed to be the good. This good, then, must be identical with the first principle of all, because it, as the explanation for the being of any complex existent, must itself be beyond ousia, that is, absolutely simple. One crucial addition. The procession always necessarily results in a diminution of some sort in relation to the cause. This is text number 18. This principle is fixed by the uniqueness and unqualified self-sufficiency of the first. What the good is, or one eternally produces, is necessarily inferior to it, owing to its complexity and hence its relative neediness. Principally, it needs a sustaining cause of the coherence or unity of its being. That is, of course, the one. So reversion, which is the tendency to fulfill the desire for the good, is perforce the tendency to retain that integral unity insofar as possible. At the eternal level, this is always possible because it is necessary. At the temporal level, it is a permanent possibility, always bound to be thwarted in its realization. Recurring to the triad representing the demiurge, its life proceeds from its being, and reversion is just the self-reflexive life of intellection. For the paradigm, its power proceeds from its essence, and its actuality is found to be the inverse of that which participates in it. Whatever participates in the paradigm seeks it according to its nature, that is, according to the part of the paradigm in which it participates. In general, and has been frequently observed, the function of the triads is to ensure metaphysical continuity from the one to matter. This is no doubt true, but hardly illuminating. Continuity here actually means that everything real here below has its causal explanation in the intelligible world. Ultimately, the eternal emanative activity of the good or one, with the instrumentality of the demiurge, the paradigm, other forms, and soul, is needed to explain all the identities and differences discoverable here below. Not only these, of course, but also all goal-directed behavior. The template for all triads is remaining, procession, and reversion. It is according to this template that all the more limited triads need to be fitted. We can, I think, go somewhat further. Consider causality. I mean efficient causality in the sensible world. David Hume, I bet you didn't think I was going to talk about David Hume, but in talking about Proclus and talking about anyone in ancient philosophy, I think it gets so complicated that we really need to recall that these are philosophers talking about philosophical issues, and that we ought to treat them as philosophers and treat their claims in a philosophical way. David Hume thought that causality was unintelligible because Hume was an empiricist And for him, the only thing that in fact makes causality intelligible is in principle not available. I mean, of course, dunamis, or potency. We cannot understand A's causing B unless we understand that A has the ability to cause B, and that this is distinct from the actualization or realization of that ability in B. As Aristotle explains, the actuality of the patient agent is in the patient, but actuality is not intelligible unless potency is. Now consider Proclean, which is Hume thought could not think is possibly true because you can't see it, you can't sense it. Now consider Proclus, an accomplished student of Aristotle, as we have seen, who is trying to understand the intelligible world in a manner faithful to Plato and to the Platonic principle that everything here is there, meaning that whatever is intelligible in the sensible world in any way is so because it participates in the intelligible world. And trying to grasp Proclus's understanding of the Platonic system, an easy but calamitous mistake is to suppose that the intelligible world is merely a static tableau in which such connections as there are non-causal, like loci on Cartesian coordinates. But as Rozan demonstrated long ago, and Gersh developed in a highly sophisticated and very illuminating way, the connections among, and Werner Barwaltis, of course, the connections among forms and between henids and forms are causal connections, making for what is admittedly a strange idea, namely eternal dynamism. I hope that the point of my referring to Hume and Aristotle is now clear, because between a cause and an effect, there is a tertium quid, namely dunamis. The reduction of causality to two terms, cause and effect, is what produced Humean skepticism. There could be no causal connections in the eternal intelligible world without this tertium quid. The Platonic provenance for this claim is striking. Plato says that the good exceeds that which has ousia in its dunamis. Thus, it is unlimited in its dunamis. Of course, this dunamis cannot be potency, which is only functionally related to actuality in the agent. To attribute potency to the good would be to destroy its unqualified simplicity. The good's overflowing is the power it eternally exercises in causing the being of everything, the union of enai and ousia and everything that has ousia in any way. An additional passage from Sophist completes this aspect of the systematic framework within which Proclus is working. The Eleatic stranger offers to materialists an irenic proposal for a horos of being, namely dunamis. This dunamis is certainly potency. Again, on the principle that whatever is here is there in a superior way. There must be dunamis in the intelligible world, and above all, in the first principle of all, where it only becomes intelligible in its effects. Here we have not only the basis for the triads, but also additional support for the postulation of henads. Thus, the henads are, as Proclus says, the one as participated. As participated, they are dunamis. As the one, they are dunamis. This triadic structure is reflected in the distinction alluded to above of to amethekton, to metochomenon, and to meteche. For any property or nature or ousia, we can distinguish it kata aitian, kata huparxin, and kata methexin. The basic triadic structure is also reflected in the famous triad of being, on, life, zoe, and intellect, onous. Corresponding to mone is ousia, to proodos is zoe, and to epistrophe is nous. Thus, intellect is eternally thinking all that is thinkable, and since thinking is the presence of intelligibles and the awareness of that presence in the identical subject in which the intelligibles are found, intellect is at once being and the activity of thinking that is life, and the reversion to that is self-awareness. The Platonic provenance for this triad is one of the most discussed passages in the Platonic tradition, taken from Sophist. This is text 21. By God, are we really going to be so easily persuaded that motion, life, soul, and wisdom are not present in perfect being, to panteloson, that it does not live and think, but that it stays in motionless and holy solemnity, bereft of intellect. It should be emphasized that this rebuke to the friends of the forms insists on the presence of motion, life, etc., in to pantelos on, not as many practitioners of the Plato-light approach would have it in on to cor, thereby making the desired concession completely anodyne and even pointless, since the friends of the forms certainly do not deny that there is motion and life in the sensible world. Proclus's effort to explain how Plato's introduction of dynamism into the intelligible world works, how it works, is as good an example of taking Plato seriously as one could ask for. Proceeding any further into the details of the multitude of triads is guaranteed to tax the patience of even a sympathetic audience. Further, Proclus's enthusiasm for seeking confirmation for the triadic structure of the intelligible world in religious texts, much like Aquinas finding in the book of Exodus confirmation for the philosophical account of God as ipsum esse subsistens, implicitly leads us away from Platonic exposition. At one point, Proclus himself acknowledges that his theological musings are his own and not Plato's. If, though, we on the one hand stay within the strict confines of Platonic metaphysics, as expressed in the dialogues and as exposed in Aristotle's writings, and on the other hand, focus on Proclus's metaphysics as found in his constructive works, then we arrive, I think, at nothing less than a profound challenge to take Plato seriously and show where Proclus goes wrong if he does in fact do so. The watershed here is the divide between those who think that the main points of Plato's metaphysics are true and those who deny this. In my opinion, the latter group of scholars are not likely to take Plato seriously as I am using these words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gerson, for this unitary and very rich talk. I suppose there must be many questions and topics for discussion, so please.
Can I ask something?
Of course.
I have found some discrepancies between Plato and Proclus. Maybe there are discrepancies only in my mind, of course. So I will tell you an example, and I would like your comment. So I will refer to the myth of air in the end of the Republic. Plato says that the souls that are going to incarnate first draw a lot, so this is an element of randomness, and then, according to their lots, decide on the lives they want to live. I believe that Plato puts this randomness element in order to make the gods not responsible for whatever bad things the persons will live. But Proclus, I don't remember where exactly, maybe in the commentary of the Republic, or maybe in the book on the Providence, or the Divine Providence. Proclus does not accept any randomness at all, and places in this place the Divine Providence in order not people to do bad stuff or something like that. So I would like your comment on this.
Thank you very much for the question. But before I make my suggestion, I might mention that I can see we have here a great expert on Proclus's commentary on the myth of Ur in book 10. John Finnemore is here working on this right now. So perhaps he'd like to add something too, but here's what I would want to say. First of all, Plato says theos anaitios. Elomeno, the one who is chosen, is responsible. And everyone that I know of accepts this in Plato, that the account of reincarnation, of punishments and rewards, however it is given, has to take this as a fundamental principle. Human beings are responsible for their fate, and not the gods. That's the first thing. As for the randomness of the lots taken, I take it that, and this is my interpretation of Proclus's interpretation of Plato, I take it that Proclus doesn't deny that there is such a thing as chance. And he thinks that Plato wants to emphasize the fact that it doesn't matter what lot you have, as Plato says, you still can have a good life. But the recognition of the existence of chance is not doesn't undercut the activity of the one and the demiurge and the providence of the gods in Proclus any more than does in Plato. The last point, to make short point, is that I think the least philosophically interesting part of Proclus's dealing with Plato is his interpretation of elements of the myth, because some of these are quasi-philosophical. And Proclus does try to do it. He doesn't shirk any difficult passages, but I think it's the least impressive philosophically in his commentaries. So that's what I would say. I would really like to know if John Finnemore had something to add or something else to say about this.
Basically, I do agree with you, Lloyd. I think that randomness is not as big of a problem as you seem to think, that there's enough lots, if you will, to allow for many different lives in many different ways. So you might not get the one where you're the philosopher in Athens, but you might get the one where you're the philosopher in Alexandria. There's always going to be a way around that.
Right.
That randomness is a small problem, and I think it's the randomness has to be there because there has to be so many choices of so many different kinds for so many different people.
Right.
Otherwise, Lloyd's right on target.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Professor Makisak, please. We cannot hear you, although you seem to be unmuted.
Who?
Oh,
Can you hear me now?
yes.
Too many microphones. Lloyd, thank you for this.
Oh, great.
How are you doing? I'm looking forward to seeing you soon. So this is, as you said, a taste of the book that you're working on. My question is about the method that you're adopting for this in the book and in this paper, because so I'd like you to clarify something. So first of all, you are not claiming that whenever we look at something in Proclus, we can find that it's already there in that shape in Plato. So, for example, the doctrine of the autopostaton and how intellect produces its own thoughts. You're instead talking about, you use the term gaps. So,
or intermediary steps, he calls the mesas. Yeah.
So it occurs to me that you sort of attributed two different things to Plato. On the one hand, and maybe you're just talking about the same thing in two different ways, but they're logically distinct, I think. There's what you could call a gap, and so that, when I'm teaching Plotinus, I sort of teach it this way, in that Plato and Aristotle leave questions, and I say to the students, exactly what is the good, and what are the forms, and so on. So there are questions in your mind, or things which I think you're right in saying you need to think about, and you can't find them explicitly there, and so you have to sort of fill in what lies in between what is said. On the other hand, you've attributed to Plato actual doctrines which can be found in the dialogues, which don't exist exactly in the way that Proclus is articulating them, but which are kind of, proto versions. And those are two slightly different things. One is to say you have the idea of the good, and you have the forms and sensible world, and how do you get from one to the other? And as we know, Proclus has an awful lot of furniture in between. And it's another thing to say that, well, remaining in procession and return is already there in some way. And I think both are, it's plausible to find both. So my question is, have you already distinguished between those? And then along with that, are you planning in the book, it would seem to me that you'd want to sort of start with, and perhaps, you draw on your other works on Plato. Well, this is what we have, right? Here's my sketch of Platonic metaphysics, including gaps and including the things which I'm going to find later. And I guess if you are talking about gaps, then it would seem to me that those could be filled in a number of ways, either by Proclus's suggestions or by Plotinus's or Damascius's or some middle Platonic one. On the other hand, if the things which you say are already there in Plato, are you at that point saying that Proclus's solution is the best, or the best way of cashing out what Plato is saying there? And I don't know if it's as clear as I can, but anyway.
Sure. Thanks, Greg. I think the way I'd want to put it, and the way I've been doing it in the book, I've got about 100,000 words and plowing on, is I'll understand gaps in two ways. The first straightforward way is that there are ontological gaps, and that's what he's talking about in the Platonic theology on the Parmenides, and he's referring to Henads, right? Proclus points out that Plato calls forms Henads, but those are the Henads that he's talking about in the rest of the Platonic theology and elements of theology in the Parmenides commentary. So those are gaps that are just left out, and we can deduce their need from reasoning. As I tried to show, there has to be something that is participated but doesn't participate, and there has to be something that's absolutely unparticipated. That's the first kind of gap. The second kind of gap is a gap in description or in detail or in refinement of the very sophisticated principle. You mentioned the self-constituted things. I think Proclus Plato, of course, thought that forms are self-constituted, but he doesn't talk about them as althouposteton, and he doesn't describe what that means, and he doesn't explain how something can be above what is self-constituted and cause what is self-constituted. Actually cause it, because oftentimes when people talk about something self-constituted, they think it means uncaused. Now, it can't mean that for Proclus, and I don't think it can mean that for Plato. So there's a gap there, not in positing things. Of course, forms are in Plato and forms are in Proclus, but there's a gap in the detailed description of what is implied by this, or what it means, or how to characterize it. So those are the two kinds of gaps, I think. And I think there's good reason to think that they're there, these gaps, and that not Proclus only, of course, but the whole later, and not even the later Platonic tradition, all the Middle Platon, 150 Middle Platonists we know names of, we're all trying to do this in one way or another. As you know, Proclus said that Plotinus was watershed here, because he's the one who understood the bare bones of this system. But and he criticizes Plotinus, as you know, right? On a number of points, Plotinus didn't go far enough. And so, as for example, once again, you know very well, he has to identify eternity as the nature of the intelligibles. And he says, that can't be, because it participates in eternity. So we have to make an ontological distinction between things that are eternal and the eternity in which they participate. Okay, so they're all engaged in a process of gap filling, whether it is filling in ontological elements that are not there, or in the reasoning pertaining to ones that are there but needs to be refined. That's what I would say.
Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Dillon.
John, hi.
Yes, I wanted to greet you, Lloyd. Congratulate you on that most thought-provoking talk. I suppose the point I would like to raise for discussion is, as you have done much to point out, Plato's. I mean, I see Plato as a man on the one hand with a succession of strong views on most subjects. On the other hand, a desire, in deference to his master Socrates, to leave an open-ended sort of tradition, rather than a dogmatic one or a closed one. But that in the immediate aftermath of his death, you agree with that, that there seemed to be a move to dogmatism. I mean, to formalizing what we believe. I would associate that with Xenocrates, particularly. But something arising from all this. But I see all these, as you say, gaps and open-endedness. But if we focus on one issue, which is a major thing, what was he up to in the second half of the Parmenides? I mean, or sort of Anglo-American logical positivist view, because it was purely dialectical or logical. But I think there's it seemed to me some evidence that even Speusippus felt, or was interpreting it as a blueprint of the universe, and that we have a first principle which is above being, and that sort of thing. And I think, what would you feel on the whole about the, and then of course henads can be drawn out of that, but what can we say about the second half of the Parmenides?
Well, in relation to the first point, very good point you raised. I don't think there's a conflict between dogmatism and the open-endedness that you mentioned, because the open-endedness is in dialogistai, it's in conversation, which the dialogues gives us, and which one presumes the academy engaged in every day. But the open-endedness is about a fundamental doctrinal structure, which everyone testifies is there, beginning with Aristotle, but also perhaps beginning with Speusippus. I agree with you and with the late, Jens Halfasen, and I know Carlos, who's here, disagrees with us, that Speusippus is a good example of this, of the constructive metaphysics in the second part of the dialogue. Very briefly, I think the theological overlay is dubious. I think, though, that the idea that there is a metaphysical system being explored is very likely to be the case. That Plato thought the good was the one, and even perhaps more likely that the one was the good, that he came to view the one as in his early Pythagorean phase, before he identified the idea of the good with that, not the other way around, as it's assumed if he did it at all. But that the one can't be one in the way that anything else is one. And forms can't be one in the way the one is one. And one being, as he argues against Parmenides and the Sophists, can't be one in the way one is one. So this is his addition, gap filling. It's he calls it a gymnasia, but it's also an expression of the necessary groundwork for gap filling to understand the nuances of oneness, or hen and henosis, and being unified and having unicity as a property, as the fundamental necessary addition to the basic structure, the basic hierarchical metaphysics.
That seems very reasonable to me.
Looking forward to seeing you in next month,
Oh, good, yes.
end of this month. Yeah.
That's why, yes. I might get that far.
Thank you. Professor Solmeyer, please.
Thanks, Lloyd, for an intriguing talk. I have to confess that Proclus is not my strong suit, far from it. And when it comes to Plato, I'm more interested in the political and moral topics, but I have been intrigued by the concept of the good for some time. So my question is mainly a question, an expository question, one of clarification. If I understand you, you're saying that the good, its function is to bring together substance and being, or ousia and ene.
Well, this
Go ahead. No, so, and at the same time, it has no dunamis. So
no, it does. Plato says that the good exceeds ousia and dunamis.
exceeds it. Yeah.
Yes.
So it doesn't have dunamis.
No, it in its dunamis, it exceeds the dunamis of anything else.
Oh, okay. So, well, that may undercut my question.
Infinite dunamis. Infinite dunamis.
Infinite dunamis. Well, my question was, I'll think about that, but my question was, I'm assuming that it had no dunamis. It sounded like the Aristotelian God that was pure
No potency. No potency. Sure, because potency is a function of actuality. No, it doesn't have potency, but it has power. That's an earlier meaning of dunamis. Power, not potency.
Well, what's the difference between power and potency?
Potency is functionally related to something else. Power isn't.
Oh, okay. All right, I'll have to think about it some more. Thanks.
Thank you. Jack Boxer.
Hey,
Hi, Jack.
thank you for the. How you doing? I really appreciate the talk. I'm looking forward to the book a lot. I wanted to ask about a little question on the Henads. And so maybe it's related to your comments on Platonism and naturalism. But I guess if the central issue is in Proclus and ancient metaphysics is how things are related somehow to the one, and the Henads are just the differentiated power of the one, how do the Henads come close to solving the issue of how the many are related to the one? It just kind of seems to push the issue back a step. Because there's
Okay. The what shall I say? The concession that Proclus makes to anti-Platonic thinkers or to Platonic thinkers who don't realize the need for the Henads is that there must be some participation in the first principle. Otherwise, it becomes irrelevant. And this is what you see in Damascus. The absolute one, you can't even talk about it because it has absolute irrelevance. But even so, he has another one, gives us another one that is relevant. So we have to have participation in the first principle without participation in the first principle. Okay, that's the conundrum. How is that possible? And he saw, or Syrianus saw, or perhaps Iamblichus first saw, as John Dillon argued, that within a polytheistic framework, we have the ability to both explain how this is in general possible, but also at the same time recognizing its obscurity. As he says, the way the gods are united is beyond us, because the part of them that isn't participated is unavailable to us. We just, as medieval scholastics saw, we don't know God's mind, right? God is penitus ignotum. It's completely unknown. However, if you know that 3 + 4 is 7, and that's an eternal truth, don't you know God's mind? That was the conundrum for the medievals, very same conundrum. Well, you could know eternal truths, but you're not knowing God's mind according to a doctrine of eternal truths not being God's mind, but being expression and so on. The various ways of Matthew Aquasparta and Henry Ghent and so on, various ways of cashing this out within a religious framework. And what Proclus does is the doctrine of henads, so that all we can know about them is their effects. So all we can know about any particular henad is the essentiality of whatever participates in it, but the henad itself, like a god, is beyond us. So here a good example of a theological motive being insinuated into the metaphysical structure, and he's not the first or the last person to do this. But what was main interest to me is the point that Plato gives us, for the first time, a first principle which is above ousia and absolutely simple, and leaves with a very difficult problem of how it is not then just written into irrelevancy by being unparticipated. Hence the doctrine of henads. By the way, in Trinitarian theology, the second person of the Trinity is the henads, right? I am the truth.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that was yes.
It's exactly the same. It's analogous, not exactly the same. It's analogous doctrine, right? How do you relate to God, participate in God? Well, the second person of the Trinity is the locus of truth. I am the truth. And for Proclus, the henads, the gods, are the locus of truth.
Okay, so could you make that analogy deeper and say something like it's also God's power in sustaining all things that would be the function of the henads in Proclus?
Sure. Of course, as Proclus shows, this is one of his very, very good arguments, that whatever is a cause of being is also a cause of sozein. These can't be separate. So it isn't that the one is the cause of the being of things at the very first, and then like a deistic God, just, my work is done here, I'm gone, I'm out of here. But the existence of everything at every moment of its existence, if it has moments of its existence, eternal things don't, is explained by the first principle of all. So yes, preservation as well as genesis.
Okay, that helps, thanks.
Thank you. Gonzalo Gamara Jordan, please, if I'm pronouncing this correctly. Hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Gonzalo, hi.
How are you? Hi, Professor Gerson. Thank you so much for your talk. He's super excited for the book. I just wanted to press on one point that was raised in the conversation with Jack, because so I understand that there is a commitment of Proclus of having the one not being participated. And I really like what you did with the henads. But also, I mean, you emphasize how also the henads cannot participate on the one.
Right.
And that left me feeling that in some way, again, we are back on one of the sides of the problem, in which it seems that the one becomes irrelevant. Because it seems to me that if there is no kind of relation that the one has to the henads and is doing nothing because it cannot be participated, then it seems that it just becomes otiose on this picture. But I know that you are aware of these problems. So I was wondering if I missed something about what is it doing? I mean, philosophically, is there anything there? Or is it just theologically that we have it?
The one, look, there are many texts in which he says the one is unparticipated. But there are also a number of texts in which he says, if the one were not, nothing would be. Nothing would exist if the one were not. So he wants to claim it's essential that the one operate. I'll use that word loosely, in order for there to be a world, and there is a world, so the one is operating. But it isn't operating in a way that generates participation. That's the problem. Stated in another way, that's a conundrum. And so we need I hesitate to say a tertium quid, because the henads aren't really part of a triadic system, much less a trinity. But they do serve to respond to the need to have first participated to explain what things are and the being of things. But this first participated can't be the first participant for the unparticipated, and it can't be so far removed from it that it's just another, like a form, participated in and participated and participates and participated. So we need a level of ontological level, which are the henads. And I only say this for the sake of illumination. If you read Trinitarian theology in the 13th century, 14th century, there's an exact analog of the problem, right? How is the first principle related? How is the first person related to the second person? And you don't want to say made, because that puts it outside and removed, but you don't want to say identical, right? So we have a second person, and the second person, what does the second person do? Well, it's a locus of truth, ontological truth. And that's what the henads are. So there's an illuminating analog between the needs of a theological need to fit it within Platonic metaphysics. Of course, other theological initiatives rejected the Platonic initiative entirely and tried to do this in a completely different way, via the reception of the anthropomorphic conception of first principle. So scriptural theology without Platonic metaphysics, which comes right up to, which is a Protestant idea, right up to the present day, doesn't worry about this, right? God is a person, and God, you can have interaction with the person. And because God is a person, God can do everything the person can do infinitely. None of this metaphysical problem arises because the Platonic metaphysics has been completely jettisoned.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
Thank you. I have a question, if I may.
Of course.
The idea that the gods are the one as participated reminds me a bit of what Olympiodorus says in the commentary on the Gorgias, that if you like, if you prefer, you can think of the gods as powers of the one God. So I was thinking of that, and of then how seriously was Plato taken in Alexandria at that time?
Well, you'll recall that Olympiodorus also says in the commentary, when he wants to talk about Socrates' daimon, we can call it conscience, wink, wink, in the idiom of the day, because there were Christians listening in, and this talk was increasingly, sanctioned. So we can translate into a Christian vocabulary. So that was Olympiodorus trying to, save his skin and to be able to continue doing what he wants to do in a Christian context.
Mhm.
No doubt there was a lot of that. Certainly that wasn't the case with Proclus, even though he was under great pressure from the Christians in Athens and third quarter of the 5th century. But I don't think I understood exactly what question you were.
The question was that do you think that that Olympiodorus could at the same time be formulating things in a way that would not offend the Christians, okay, but at the same time he may be echoing a Proclean approach, in the sense that this would not offend pagans either. So from a Proclean point of view, it can perhaps be said that the gods are, in a sense, the powers of the one God. So that was.
Yeah, more in Olympiodorus certainly than in Proclus. Proclus doesn't compromise much. Obviously, or apparently, he had students like Pseudo-Dionysius who felt very comfortable in taking over the Platonic metaphysics and putting this within a Christian context. And then later Maximus the Confessor and other Christian Platonists. But I think the fundamental and unbridgeable gap, sorry for gap, between Proclus and his Christian opponents, contemporaries, students, Christian students, was the anthropomorphizing of the first principle. It's a little ironic because in Proclus, there's a lot of anthropomorphizing of the second principles. That is all that he gets from the Chaldean oracles and the Orphic. And he's very comfortable in talking about the Olympic deities. Although he doesn't talk about them in that loose anthropomorphizing sort of way that he criticizes Plato for doing and others for doing earlier. I think the fundamental divide is that the first principle of all is not a person. Not a person. It's a pure metaphysical principle. And all we can understand about it is what we understand in metaphysics. Whereas the attempt to join scriptural tradition and metaphysics, which is what the early Christian Platonists were trying to do, was for Proclus unacceptable and ultimately impossible and failed job. So I don't think Proclus did it. I have no idea whether Olympiodorus only did it, under duress and unseriously. But eventually they were overwhelmed by the Christian Platonism.
Well, thank you very much. If there are no other questions, let us thank Professor Gerson again for the great talk, and thank you all for the very rich discussion. And perhaps let us also renew our appointment for June and Dublin, at least
Yes.
some of us.
Looking forward to it very much.
So thank you again, Professor Gerson.
Okay.
Thank you all.
For having me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.